Welcome back to the B&H event space. You are tuned in to managing high-resolution imagery and video with Sony Artisan, Andrew Geraci. Andrew, what's going on, man? Been a while.
Derek, it has been a while, and your voice is so smooth and dreamy. It's very
It's
buttery. I love
it's
that.
like Irish butter, the
It
expensive
is like
kind that
Irish
Fred
butter.
buys.
Not that cheap margarine. No, this is
No,
this is
no
great.
margarine. This is
No
this is
margarine
the
at
good
all.
stuff. And you're providing the good stuff today. And this is so needed because I actually look, I just got a new hard drive in the mail
Fantastic.
because high resolution imagery. It's a weekly thing,
That's why I
man.
only use data force for high resolution imagery. But yeah, no,
There we
we're gonna
go.
be gonna
So
be chatting anything and everything that's data related, and hopefully helping people kind of navigate those little spaces on whether it's a budget oriented data transfers and services or higher end kind of enterprise management. We're getting into like the petabytes of data storage, so we're gonna be covering that all day. Or for the next hour or so, and then diving into anything that any questions or anything that anyone might have. So make it happen.
awesome. Well, I'll leave it to the expert, you, and I'll throw this out here. Huge thank you, of course, to Sony for hosting and to Andrew for gracing us with his presence, his knowledge, his experience, and to all of you out there for joining us. We'd love to get your questions in. Andrew has welcomed them during the presentation. So if you're joining us live on YouTube, feel free to check in with a question during the presentation. And if you don't know about our YouTube, head over and look up B&H Event Space. Andrew, I'll see you in a bit with some Q&A.
Awesome. Perfect. Thanks, Derek. Everyone, thanks for joining me. I'm Andrew Geraci. I'm a photographer, cinematographer, and I'm a Sony Artisan of Imagery. And basically, today we're going to be talking about data management, how to take those high resolution photos or videos. So for me, I use my Sony A7R as well as my Sony A1 when I shoot 8K video, and also my fun, fancy FX3. So there's a lot of different areas where data is absolutely important. Give me 1 second. I'm going to throw up a fun little PowerPoint slide. Then we're going to jump right into talking about data and then basically how to manage that data from pre-production to actual production to post-production and then beyond for archiving and other purposes. So 1 second. Lovely. So a little bit about me. Hey guys, I'm Andrew, and I basically specialize in 8K motion control time lapse, as well as aerial drone operations, high resolution video production, and I work for a lot of second unit feature films when it comes to the VFX work that you might see in the background. So all of these things that I deal with though on a daily basis are resolutions anywhere from 8K to even 20K to 32K. It really just depends on what kind of project I'm working on. For the most part, I think 8K is one of those sweet spots for working in high resolution, but with using high resolution imagery comes a ton of data storage. And we're going to talk about how to artfully and craftfully take your data so that it works for you and not against you. And yeah, that'll be fun. Just a little bit about me though. I'm going to show you guys a little bit of the work that I've done so you can kind of see where I'm coming from, and then we'll jump right into getting to that bread and butter of data management. Boom. Now, what we're going to talk about is why data management is so important. And as you guys saw there, that's about 15 years worth of work put together from probably 5 or 6 dozen different productions. And during the course of that time, I've probably amassed a little over 1.7 petabytes of data that I store on my personal server. And one of those things is, you want to make sure that you're able to retrieve that data and store it effectively and efficiently, because you never know when you want to use it. If you want to put together a reel, if you want to use it for social media content, being able to store your data is absolutely imperative to making sure that you both, retain a great archive, but also so that that data is safe. So if you do want to use it in the future, you have that ability to do that. And one thing that I've learned in the last couple of years is you don't want to skimp on data, because data management is absolutely important. Data security is absolutely important, and making sure that you handle those files correctly and create duplicates is also very important. So I'm going to tell you a little bit of a story that I just had. This is from a feature film that we were working with at IMAX and Disney last year, right before the strikes happened. And it was a really exciting project working in Disney World. I can't really say too much more about it. But ultimately, we had 6 cameras going that were shooting resolutions of 10K, and basically bringing down about 4 terabytes of content every day for 32 days of filming. And to do that, it took a tremendous amount of data and storage workspaces. And one thing that we really relied heavily upon were external NVMe SSDs. And you'll probably hear me say this a lot during the course of this workshop, but basically, NVMe SSDs are really where it's at these days, especially if you're looking for speed, performance, and even something that's cheaper to use. But at the same time, there are other options. You want to look at higher volume disks and whatnot. But for what we're doing on this particular project, having the ability to onload and offload terabytes of data, ranging from 1,000 megabytes to even 2,000 megabytes per second was pretty imperative, because when you're downloading 4 terabytes of data every day, you're looking at basically hours of time that's just passing by, that you could be doing something else, which is why if you're using slower, more inferior drives, it could take you days to transfer what you shot on that day. So it's really important that when you are doing your data, that you make sure that your transfer speeds, that what kind of devices you want to be using, and that you plan for how much data you plan on using during a shoot. And for this particular shoot, we'd only planned on having about, I only want to say probably about 75 terabytes. So we ended up having to go back out and purchase a ton of additional things. And it really made for not necessarily a headache, but we really had to make sure that we knew what we were doing ahead of time. That way we could, make sure we had the data available. So when you're out there on your pre-production scouts, you really want to make sure that you know how much data you have. And I apologize, my phones are blowing up right now. Turn things off. And there we go. And so for this particular data, we had 128 terabytes of data, and we were basically taking those dailies and putting them to and from NVMe SSD RAIDs, which I'll be showing you guys a little bit about those in a little bit. But they really helped out when it came to the file transfer process, because when you're transferring terabytes of data, you need something that's fast and reliable. And we were able to transfer at about 2,800 megabytes per second. And to me, that is fast, but there's even faster that I know that's out there. And what I really want to do is just help you guys that are out there understand how important data is, and that you choose the right drives when it comes to the type of work set that you're looking for. So the best meter to use, especially if you're shooting on, let's say, any of the Sony cameras, the A7S or the A7R5 or the FX3, and so on and so forth. But there's a lot of, not really, there's no debate about this, but UHS-2 SD cards are probably your cheapest bet when you're looking for a budget option, but they do transfer relatively slow. And when you are shooting higher resolution content, I really suggest using CF Express A cards, because they can transfer anywhere between 800 to 700 megabytes per second, which when you're downloading that material, whether it's a 300 gig or a 160 gig card, you can get that down in like 15 minutes or so, which is absolutely great. And if you're in a situation like I was, you want to be able to transfer and offload those cards relatively quickly. Otherwise, your DIT is going to be sitting there for a while, or you yourself are going to be sitting there for a while it transfers. And right now, Compact Flash Express A and B and C cards are probably the fastest on the market, which is why pretty much all of the new modern cameras utilize one of those types of cards. So if you have that ability to use a CF Express card, highly recommend using them because they are just so fast. And they also allow your camera to shoot at higher frame rates as well as higher bit rates. So if you're using something like the A1 that has an 8K sensor readout, you can actually shoot at full resolution on that and not have any stutter or drops in your frames when you're shooting. The same would go for the FX3 if you're shooting 4K 120. And if you're shooting on the A1 and you're doing bursts in RAW, having the CF Express card really allows you to get in there and make sure that you're getting the full processing power of that camera. Otherwise, what's going to happen is you'll get a bottleneck, which we'll talk about in a little bit too, when it comes to the UHS SD. When it comes to the UHS-2 SD cards, just because they have a much slower transfer rate, which is why a lot of times, if you are shooting video, you're going to be shooting at V100 to V200, which allows you to shoot those higher resolutions and higher frame rates as well, which is really important. Now, when it comes to actually understanding what you need to drive this data, you have to understand that not all computers are created equal. If you buy the latest and greatest, Mac or latest and greatest in PC, you really still have to make sure that you're buying the right components, because you could be buying something that's expensive, but maybe it doesn't have the right amount of PCIe lanes, or it doesn't have the amount of, or it's using older generation transfer protocols, which is really nerdy, and we're going to get into some nerdy stuff now. But all this stuff is hopefully great information that you guys will be able to use and then utilize and basically make better decisions when it comes to purchasing your equipment. So for me, I use two different setups. I'm mainly PC, but I also have Apple as well. But for myself, I use a custom Threadripper Pro 3975. It's 32 core processor. I've got 256 gigs of RAM. And I'm also using a 48 gig RTX A6000. And I also have 16 terabytes of NVMe SSD built in internally on my computer. That way, if I'm working on any projects, I can easily use them inside of DaVinci Resolve or After Effects or Premiere Pro, and we'll be able to get the maximum bandwidth there possible. And because I'm using I would call it an enterprise computer, it has 192 lanes of PCIe, which we'll talk about as well, and it's Gen 4. And then I'm also using a brand new Intel 24 cores, 6.2 gigahertz processor with 128 gigs of RAM, DDR5 RAM as well. And then using an RTX 4090, which I absolutely love. If you're a gamer, you definitely want to go with that setup too, but we're talking images today. And as well, I also have a 16 terabyte NVMe SSD attached to that that's rated, and it gets a whopping 22,000 megabytes per second, which is pretty fast. So obviously, we'll talk about bandwidth in a second, but when it comes to these systems, you really definitely want to make sure that, one, you have enough pipelines, and we're going to talk about those right now, which is PCIe lanes. And PCIe lanes really come into the PC world. Apple does use them, but they're pretty lip tight on what generation that they use, because they kind of use a mix of both Gen 3 and Gen 4. I do not believe Apple is using Gen 5 yet, but maybe we'll see that with the M3 chips that come out. But currently in the PC world, Gen 5 is the fastest that you can get, and it transfers at almost a whopping 4,000 megabytes per second, which is absolutely insane. And when you consider, if you're stacking multiple hard drives together or multiple NVMe drives together, you could substantially be getting anywhere from, 12,000 megabytes per second all the way up to where I'm at in 22,000 megabytes per second, which is just pretty damn fast. But really, when you are looking for and or shopping around for computer hardware, you really want to look at probably purchasing the more newer end of the computers. PCIe Gen 4 is relatively new. It's about 4 years old, but and it does transfer relatively fast at 2,000 megabytes per second almost. But right now, Gen 5 is the fastest, and Gen 6 will be out later this year, where we'll actually probably see that number double again, which will be absolutely insane if you're trying to do high resolution video or photos, which is going to be fantastic for a lot of us out there. But again, we're going to have to wait. And you really do have to do your due diligence when you are picking up a computer, because you want to make sure that the motherboard and the CPU are correct and that you have the correct number of pipelines. And if you are looking at the Apple computers, you definitely want to make sure that you purchase the highest amount of RAM, because that cache is going to also be implemented when it comes to the file transfer. And the more cache that you have, the faster and more consistent your data transfer rates will be, which is super important, because you can buy a really fast drive, but if that drive doesn't have the pipelines or the bandwidth to use it, you're going to see it just drop off. And we'll talk about that a little bit later too, because a lot of times I've seen a lot of photographers that go out there and they'll purchase these really fast drives, but they don't have any cache on them. And what happens is you'll see it's really fast at the beginning, and then all of a sudden it'll drop from 1,000 bytes a second down to like 400 or even 300 megabytes per second and stay that way. And that's due to cache. So there's a lot of things that are involved that I would say the majority of people don't know, and you don't necessarily have to know, but if you really want to get into the weeds of things and really make it so your data is transferred faster, understanding these key aspects really will help a lot in that. When it comes to I/O options, there are a ton of drives on the market, and most of them are USB, and some of them are Thunderbolt. Now, my recommendation is, regardless if you're using Windows or Apple, you want to be probably using Thunderbolt 3 or Thunderbolt 4, because it definitely has the highest transfer rate at 40 gigabits per second, or 4,000 megabytes per second max. And obviously these are, we'll just say theoretical, because there's always a lot of different things that come into play when you're actually transferring data, whether it's the size of the data, the cache that you have on board, the length of your cable. All these things add to either the speeding up of your connection or the slowing down of it. But for the most part, Thunderbolt Series 3 and 4 are the best on the market right now, and I would highly suggest utilizing those. But if you don't have that, USB 4 does have a 40 gigabit option as well, and then USB 3.2 would be my next choice, because there are two versions of that also give you a 10 gigabit or even a 20 gigabit with a 2x connection. And I think it's absolutely necessary if you're trying to do large transfer files. You definitely want to be looking at, I would probably say, obviously stay away from USB 2.0, because it's just absolutely slow and cumbersome to use. And even USB 3.1, which I don't have on here, or actually it is, but it's mislabeled, only transfers at 5 gigabits per second, which is pretty slow. And your max range is going to be about 625 megabytes per second. And I would say on average, you're probably looking more around 350 to 400 megabytes per second. But USB 3.2 is acceptable in today's world. But again, I would really suggest going for that USB 4, which is brand new. There aren't a lot of drives out right now that utilize USB 4, and there aren't a lot of drives that utilize USB or Thunderbolt 4 either. But they should be coming out shortly. They had some fun things at NAB to share. But you just definitely want to future-proof your in and out options, just because the more relevant you stay, the more your data is going to be protected, and just obviously take less time to get to and from whatever destination you want to get to. So we're going to talk about internal storage, because I think that it's really important that you understand that not all drives are created equal, just as not all computers are created equal. And let's just say your standard 5.5-inch hard drive, they transfer very slowly. Like these are devices that were back from the 90s and early 2000s, and they transfer about 120 megabytes a second maximum. And realistically, you're probably looking more at around 90 to 100 megabytes. And then your SSDs, which kind of came to fruition at the beginning of 2000, only transfer around 550 megabytes, which is still plenty fast, especially if you're doing like 4K video and high resolution photography. But if you're getting into 8K video, even SSDs really don't hold up that well. And that's why you really want to be checking out NVMe SSDs Gen 4 or Gen 5, because you can get anywhere from 7,500 to 12,000 megabytes per second, which is just mind-blowing. And because these are internal storage options, you are actually going to see those data rates actually come to life, because they actually work with the computer. Now, what the big bottleneck is, and we'll talk about this in just a second, is being able to choose one device and say it's transferring NVMe, but you're transferring NVMe to a hard drive. Now, what's going to happen is that the hard drive is going to be your slowest link, which means that's going to be the fastest that you can transfer at. So if you are thinking about external storage and internal storage, you really want to make sure that you match the types of drives that you're using. So if you're using an external NVMe, you should be also using an internal NVMe on your computer. That way they maintain the right data transfer rates, or at least can have better sustained higher transfer rates. Because the last thing you want to be doing is transferring, 20 terabytes worth of data versus a hard drive, which will end up taking you a week to do. And that's no fun for anybody. Now, for the external storage options, especially when you're on set or you're out in the field, these are a few that I've used in the past. I'm not really honestly using any of the standard hard drives anymore. But SanDisks, if you've ever seen the little Pro ones, you can kind of see it in the background of the photo here. But they've been really good, and their average transfer speeds are around 620 to 700 megabytes per second. They're very portable. I will say SanDisk has had a big issue though with their drives that were, I guess, created at the end of 2022. A lot of failure rates. I've had a bunch of mine just die on me during production, and it's not great. So be cautious when you do that. I think that they've fixed the problem, but I would also, be cautious when you do that. And Lacey, which I think is probably one of the most iconic drives, you can see that in the background there too, has the orange rim around it. And it's just a standard hard drive, and it transfers at 90 to 120 megabytes per second. I would say these aren't very viable anymore. If you have one as like a last case scenario, you can use it, but really I'd probably say stay away from it. And then I've got another one of the Samsung T7s and T9s. You can see that in the foreground. Again, that's a standard SSD. And there is one that is also an NVMe, that's kind of a micro NVMe, and they transfer anywhere from 240 to 450 megabytes per second realistically. And they've been really good, especially if you're looking for just something that's like small and portable. There's no power that's required to it, and it works really well. Now, what I've been using currently for the last 2 years are the OWC Mercury Pro NVMe RAIDs, and because it's rated, I can actually have it transfer at incredible speeds at its max throughput at 2800 megabytes per second, which is absolutely fantastic, especially like I said, I was using it on this feature film, and we were able to transfer 120 terabytes of data over 32 days every day, and it was absolutely fantastic. And if you are on the more budget side of things, pardon me, the Thunder Bay 4 RAID 0 hard drive set is also pretty decent. It's a cheaper solution because it's using regular hard drives. It also means you can have a higher capacity. So if you're looking to do a 32 or even a 48 terabyte collection of drives, that's a great way to do it. The only problem is even though it's rated together and you're going to get around 425 to 500 megabytes per second, it's still pretty slow. And I will say that I have had issues with formatting as well as corruption, and those are things you really have to kind of be aware of when you're taking these out in the field, which is why we really want to make sure that we have backups, which we'll also talk about very shortly. But for me, right now, I would say that the OWC Mercury Pro is definitely the way to go if you're looking for higher end NVMe storage, and then using something like the SanDisk or Samsung NVMe portable drives are a really great secondary, and they can transfer whether you're on PC or Mac, and they're fantastic. So this is a photo from one of my Gen 4 RAIDs to one of my Gen 5 RAIDs internally on my computer. And as you can see, I'm getting about 3.2 gigabytes per second. I was able to transfer, I think this is around 150 gigs, 160 gigs or so. And it transferred in about 15 seconds, which was pretty damn fast. And if you see there at the beginning, and this is a fun little thing, you can see that the data transfer rates weren't happening at the very beginning, and that's because I had my web browser open. And if you have programs like web browsers or things that are memory intensive, what that's going to do is actually bog down your system and close up the pipelines that you're using when it comes to your disk transfers. So when you are doing disk transfers, if you want to have the fastest possible speed, I highly recommend shutting down any and all programs that you're using, especially any that are using a high volume amount of RAM, because that's just going to deplete what is going to happen with your transfer cache. So if you do have a browser open, just shut it down when you're doing transfers, and you'll likely see a fairly large spike or increase in your performance. And I think a lot of people are oblivious to that sometimes. And I know just by working on a bunch of different projects myself, I've always like, why is this going so slow? And then you close your web browser and then it just speeds all the way up. So keep that in mind. But speed is the end goal, because when you're transferring all these large files, you want to be able to do it fast and efficiently. That way you can get back to doing all the fun creative stuff and not the boring data stuff. Now, we're going to talk about bottlenecking, because bottlenecking is super important, and it's one of those things that you really have to look out for. And as I had said before, your slowest connection is going to be the fastest you can transfer ever. So it doesn't matter if you're using a $1,000 NVMe stick that transfers at 12,000 megabytes per second. If you're transferring to something that is slower than it, you're only going to be able to go as fast as that other drive. And in the same vein, you're only going to be able to go as fast as the port that it's connected to. So if you're using something like a USB 3.2 and you have a hard drive and you also have an NVMe that are trying to communicate together, you're going through two different bottlenecks. The first bottleneck is going to be the fact that it's a 1 or a 10 gigabit connection. So the fastest that could be at 3.2 is 10, or let's just say 1,000 megabytes per second. And then you're hitting your hard drive, which it's at its fastest can go 120 megabytes per second. So you're going to see that actually trickle down into like almost a drip of data into your computer, which is why a lot of people that were using old Drobos that were utilizing USB 3 ports would only see somewhere between like a 30 megabyte to 60 megabyte transfer speed. So it's really important to, again, know and understand what hardware you're using and that your computer is up to date. The more modern computer you have, the more likely that you have a higher connection speed in your USB or Thunderbolt ports. And it's really important because you're going to spend a lot of money on data. You want to make sure that it's being transferred and utilized at its full potential and capacity. Otherwise, you're just basically wasting money away. So if you don't have the means to purchase a good computer or purchase a computer that is more modern or has the more modern protocols, then really there's probably no honest reason to purchase higher, more expensive gear until you actually upgrade your computer, because you can transfer it to something very quickly. But if you're transferring from it and it can't get to the computer that you need to, that's going to be the biggest issue. So again, think about bottlenecking and try to match your components as far as speed for speed, cache for cache. And that's going to really allow you to make sure that you're making the best choices when it comes to your data. Perfect. And it looks like there's a couple questions. Oh, hey, Naya, great to see you. And we're coming back down here. So for me, I think one of the biggest issues that you're going to see as an editor for video in bottlenecking is when you're using something like 8K footage or even 4K 120, and let's just say you're inside DaVinci Resolve and you're editing and you come across the fact that your footage is stuttering. Now, it can be because you're using a long GOP codec, which is something like H.265, which isn't the best for editing. But it could also come down to the speed at which your hard drives are working. So if you have a faster internal hard drive, like an NVMe SSD, you're going to see that the timeliness and the lag in your timeline will basically decrease, which is absolutely fantastic. You can also transcode long GOP footage like H.265 to ProRes, and then you'll also see that increased performance too. But I will say a lot of people are utilizing drives that they shouldn't be and playing content off drives they shouldn't be. And that's why they experience a lot of lag on their timeline or stuttering, or it just doesn't play back correctly. So choosing the right internal hard drive will really help change and mold the way that you edit your videos and photos as well. All right. Now, when it comes to choosing a drive, the first thing you want to look for are the read-write speeds. And a lot of the times, if you look on the package here to the right, these are Gen 4 and Gen 5. Now, every generation basically doubles in speed and capacity, not capacity, but speed at least. So you could go from 4,000 megabyte per second all the way up to 8 or even 12,000 if you go up to Gen 5. And the next thing you want to look for is disk cache. Now, cache is really important, and a lot of people kind of put this to the wayside, but the more cache you have, the more data is going to be able to be, let's just call it a pre-roll into your memory, and that's going to allow those data rates to be more sustained and more consistent when you're transferring large volumes of data, whether that data is from small files like photos or larger files like video files. Obviously, when you're dealing with smaller files, you have to understand that smaller files actually transfer slower than larger files. And disk cache is kind of a big reason behind that. So the more disk cache you can find, which you can look in the specifications on the box, it should tell you how much disk cache it is. Sometimes it can be 64 megabytes. Sometimes it can be 128 megabyte or gigabytes, I'm sorry, or 256 gigabytes. But really, the more that you can find, the better transfer rates you're going to see. Now, it doesn't necessarily equate to faster transfer rates, but you'll have more sustained transfer rates. And if you remember back to that image I just showed you at the very beginning there, that's kind of showing you the inconsistencies in transfer rates and how when you unblock or unclog the bottleneck, it just flows so much better. And then capacity. The larger drives that you use, you will find that they are faster than the lower capacity cards. So if you're comparing a 1 terabyte card to a 4 terabyte card, the 4 terabyte will transfer, have it, or I should say, have a faster read-write speed if you're looking at it internally than the smaller capacity one. Now, it's not going to be a huge difference, but there will be a difference, and the larger you have, the better. Now, there's a lot of different budgets. People are coming into this industry. People have been in this industry, and there's a lot of different options you guys have when it comes to selecting the drives. And for me, the external drives are a really good choice if you can find a high volume drive. So something in the 4 terabytes to even 8 terabytes is a great choice. If you obviously don't plan on shooting a ton of stuff in the year, you don't have to get super high capacity, but you should be thinking about the future. And when you are purchasing these things, just remember, like, you could purchase, a terabyte for $150, or you could purchase a 2 terabyte for $200. So just for an extra $50, you get an extra terabyte versus having to pay another $150 for just another terabyte. So think about those when you're looking at your cost ratios. And then utilizing NVMe SSDs are probably the way to go, especially if you want speed and reliability. And they're not necessarily super budget friendly, but they have come down in the past, and you can get very cheap NVMe drives today. And then there's also cloud storage. Now, I will say I am a huge advocate of not using cloud storage. And I'll tell you a fun little story why, because I was working on a project a few years ago and we're using AWS servers, and one of the servers went down and we lost all of our data. And we were working off of that data. It was in the cloud, and we were told that that was basically our backup to our cold storage footage that we had, but we didn't have the ability to pull it out of cold storage as quickly as we needed to, but we lost all of that data. And when you lose cloud storage data, there's no getting it back. So be really cautious about the information that you put out there. If you are using cloud storage, do not use it for archiving purposes. Use it for transferring or doing client-to-client services. But I really wouldn't I don't put a lot of stock into cloud storage at this time, just because you can do more locally and it's cheaper at the same time too. But cloud storage is an option if you are looking for something that's cheap and you maybe, let's just say, only use a terabyte a year or even less than a terabyte a year. Cloud storage is a really good way to go. But just remember that they will basically hold your data hostage for a subscription plan. So keep that in mind. Now, large budget, which is where I love to be, and that's utilizing NAS systems, which are network attached storage. And we're going to be diving into those right after this. But NAS systems are the best things to have because they allow you to not only back up and archive your footage, and you can also work off your NAS systems, but you can also log into them remotely from anywhere in the world, which makes them a very desirable thing to have. It's kind of like having your own cloud storage locally, but you don't have to worry about ever losing your data. And within those NAS systems, you come up across RAID arrays, and we'll discuss RAIDs after this as well. But RAIDs are great because they allow you to have redundancy. So if you have a disk failure, and believe me, if you've been in this business long enough, you will definitely have a RAID failure or a disk failure. So having redundancy is absolutely imperative to have. And we will, again, talk about RAIDs in a second. But next, and then enterprise grade solutions. This is if, let's just say, you're working for a very large production company and you need petabytes of data. That's a really great way to do that and utilize these different enterprise services. I would say this is probably out of the range for 99% of people out there, just because you're probably going to be spending $10,000 a month on storage, which, let's just be honest, there's not a lot of us that are going to be doing that. And the same thing again with cloud storage. There are higher AWS server-like services out there that can deal with petabytes as well. But again, you're talking about big money. And again, I really wouldn't use it for offsite backing up, but it's great for localized, or not localized, but current storage. So let's talk about NAS workflow. And I love NAS so much because if you are a Windows or a Mac user, you can literally connect both of your systems together, and the NAS will actually allow you to transfer between both systems seamlessly. So this allows you to basically get the best of both worlds. So you don't really have to worry about your data because it has its own operating system and basically acts as its own independent computer, just kind of sitting there in space. And there's a huge variety of NAS systems out there. And I'm only using QNAP, or I'm showing you guys QNAP right here because that's what I use. I'm not sponsored by QNAP. I don't really care what you guys use. I think Synology is out there. I think they make some great products. And there's a few other self-made NAS systems that you can do yourself by converting an old tower into just a disk management system. But for the most part, I really enjoy using these tabletop type NAS systems as well as rack mounts. And hold on one second. I think for the majority of users that are out there, a 4 to 6 bay is probably that sweet spot where you could buy two 24 terabyte drives and get, a ton, almost 100 terabytes of space in there if you're using the four slots. And then if you're a more pro user, let's just say you want to be able to handle over 100 terabytes. You're looking for 200 terabytes, maybe even 300 terabytes. Going with a 16 bay is probably the way to go. And that's what I currently use. So on the right-hand side there, I use a bunch of the 12 bay rack mounts, and I, network all those together, and I'm able to basically back up and save all of my content locally and remotely at the same time. And it just saves so much energy and money when you're out there working. And I think for a lot of folks, especially if you're on the road, having this type of system where you could potentially upload to it while you're on the road is really great, and can really help and benefit a lot of people's workflows. But again, I think your 4 to 6 bay is the right way to go. And if you are looking at these, all of these systems come with built-in SSD cache. Now you have to purchase the drive separately, but what this allows you to do is, let's just say you put in a 2 terabyte SSD cards in your NAS system. That's going to allow that to basically pre-roll the bandwidth, so that if you are transferring 100 terabytes or 100 gigabytes of images, it'll have that already cached up in the SSD, and it's just absolutely beautiful. And you can get sustained read-write speeds of 1,000, 2,000, or even 4,000 megabytes per second if you're using a 40 gigabit connection. And that's what we're going to talk about next, because that is kind of the question of the hour, is choosing what kind of connection to use. I would say at this point, it's 2024, 1G is dead. If you're using Cat5 cable or USB, you're pretty much, it's not going to work. You definitely want to be focusing more on 10 gigabit, 20 gigabit, 40 gigabit, or even 100 gigabit, which has just come out recently. I've been starting to migrate all of my systems over to 40 gigabit as well as 100 gigabit, and it's a huge difference. So if you're looking at it from the perspective of someone that's transferring data, obviously 10 gigabit is going to allow you to transfer at 1,000 to 1,250 megabytes per second. And that utilizes Cat7 cable, which is pretty standard for a lot of folks now. You can also use a new connector, or not a new, but a connector called SPF Plus, as well as USB 3.2. It is important to know that USB cannot be networked though, and USB is only for transferring to and from a protocol. So if you are networking this, you definitely want to be using Cat 5, 7, 8 SPF Plus or a Thunderbolt connection. And right now, the 40 gigabit Thunderbolt connections are absolutely insane. They're fantastic. I love them. But one thing you have to be careful with Thunderbolt is that they do disconnect pretty regularly. I've worked on my PC as well as my Mac, and both of them have disconnected during transfers or if they time out. So Thunderbolt is kind of a finicky connection, and I wouldn't rely on it as a networking connection, but there are definitely other options for networking connections that are 40 gigs and above, which will actually allow you to transfer at 4 gigabytes per second, which is pretty damn fast. Now, when it comes to RAID selection for your drives that you're choosing, RAID 0 is not necessarily, you definitely want to stay away from RAID 0. We'll just put it that way. RAID 0 is going to give you the fastest speed possible when you're reading and writing to that drive, but there's no protection for it whatsoever. So if one drive fails, let's just say you're using an 8-bay NAS system, if one drive fails, you are pretty much SOL. all your data is going to be lost, and there may be a way to retrieve it. However, it's not going to be easy or cheap. And this brings me back to a fun little story. When I first started in this business, I had purchased I think it was just a 32 terabyte RAID drive, which was also a NAS. And one of the drives got corrupt. I was in RAID 0. I lost all of my data. I had to send that data out to a data recovery center, and it cost about $5,500 just to retrieve that data, on top of having to actually pay and purchase new drives to put that data on. So if you don't want to be paying a ton of money, definitely make sure you're choosing a RAID 5 or 6, because with RAID 5, you're basically going to take, if you have 5 drives, you're going to take 1 drive out of those 5, and that's going to become a redundancy. And that's going to allow you to at least lose 1 drive. And if you lose 1 drive, you can just replace it, repopulate that drive, and then it'll become back to normal. But with all of these, with the protection versus speed, you are losing speed the higher RAID numbers you go. So RAID 6 is great for another, higher protection. So you have the failure of 2 drives to fail, and you want to be using at least 6 or more drives for that. If 2 drives fail, you can, obviously retain all of your information and get that back. And then a RAID 10 is basically a 1-to-1 split. If you have 10 drives, 5 drives are for backup purposes only, and the other 5 are for data. Now, with each of these, the amount of data you actually can store also decreases. So RAID 0 is going to give you the actual number of terabytes. So if you have 128 terabytes of RAID storage, you will have 128 terabytes of disk storage. But with RAID 5, you're going to see the reduction is down 20%, 30%, and then 50% all the way down to RAID 10, which will again give you a 1-to-1 almost. So these are things to think about when you're setting up your RAID, but for the most part, RAID 5 or RAID 6 is what you want to be doing for your NAS setups. Now, when it comes to archiving data, this is something that I just started doing a couple years ago, and that's utilizing LTO tapes. But before I say that, I should say backing up is one of those things that you must do. And I can't, I've had so many issues where I have lost data and haven't backed stuff up, and it's come to bite me in the butt sometimes, that you definitely want to make sure that you always have 3 copies on hand, 2 local, 1 offsite. And offsite could mean either cloud-based storage, or you're utilizing an offsite server farm where you just have your information stored at. But it's really important, especially if you're utilizing or you want to be able to bring that content back, because you could end up having it destroyed or gone forever. So keeping a backup or archiving is super important. And then to the right here, you can see that this is what's called an LTO tape. And LTO tapes really kind of started hitting the market probably about a decade ago, honestly. And what was great about them is that they are cheaper per terabyte than current hard drives, but they're just a little bit slower. But one thing that I love about LTO tape is just the lifespan. You're going to be getting anywhere from 15 to 30 years per tape, which means that if you're into production, you don't really have to worry about having the disk degrade over time like you can with standard hard drives. Or if something happens and the spindle gets broken on your spinning disk, and you just lose data left and right. But LTO tape is great because you can get both compressed and uncompressed storage. And right now in 2024, we are up to Gen 9. Gen 10 was supposed to come out last year. I think it's coming out this year. But if you look at it, you get 48 terabytes per disk. And right now, the LTO 9 discs are only going for $85 to $100 for 45 terabytes. Now, that is absolutely fantastic. And that's one of the reasons why I really enjoy using LTO, because it's strictly for archiving purposes, but it means your data is going to be secure, and you can put a ton of data per cassette tape, basically. And it transfers relatively fast via Thunderbolt 3 or 4 at 350 megabytes per second. But I've also heard that there's going to be faster transfer speeds of up to 600 or even 700 megabytes per second, which would be pretty incredible. But I think we'll see that towards Gen 11, Gen 12, which theoretically this is supposed to come out every 2 years. And for the last 4 years, they've basically been stalled because of COVID. We've been stuck at LTO 9, Gen 9. But hopefully when Gen 10 and Gen 11 come out, it's going to be absolutely incredible to get 240 terabytes per tape, and maybe you spend, $300 for that at the most. It's going to be fantastic. Now, the downside to LTO is just that the initial cost for the unit itself is pretty pricey at around $5,500 for a unit. And these go all the way up to even $8,000 or $9,000. So it's definitely an investment. But if you are archiving and you have a ton of data, if you have petabytes of data, I really recommend getting LTO tape. If you don't have LTO tape, what you can do is just RAID a bunch of drives together, like hard drives. And they're good for short term. I will say I have lost in the last 15 years probably 20 or 30 disk drives that I had started using back in, let's just say 2004, 2005. So disks definitely degrade in quality. You get a lot of issues and errors with them, but they do have faster transfer rates because if we do have, let's just say 12 of these connected together, we can get anywhere from 1,200 to 1,500 megabytes per second. Or if we have a 16 bay, we can easily hit 2,000 megabytes per second, which is great. And the drives are relatively cheap. You can get a 24 terabyte currently for $450. Which means if you wanted to get 288 terabytes, you'd only be paying $5,400, which is pretty fantastic. In comparative to LTO, this is a slightly cheaper option, but then you also have to remember that you have to purchase your RAID bay or your NAS system that you're using, which could end up costing you another $1,500 to $3,000. So really it comes down to what your budget is. LTO tape is where I prefer to go, but there's nothing wrong with hard drives so as long as you're routinely swapping out drives and refreshing your units. And to the right there's my cat editing because he just loves to edit. No, he doesn't. Now, programs to manage your data are really important. I've been using Hedge for the last, I don't know, 8 years almost. And I love Hedge because it's great for DITs. If you're on site, it allows you to connect to every drive and destination that you have hooked up to your computer. So you can easily take, let's just say, if I'm using one of my CF Express cards, I can take that and basically disseminate it into 3 other drives that I might have attached to my computer or even external NAS drives. And that way that data is getting transferred simultaneously at the same time to those drives. And I know that I'm getting the information because it's going to create what's called a checksum file. And I can go in there and make sure that files 1 through 100 made it to destination A to B. And that's really one of the best things I really enjoy about this type of program because it allows me, or I guess I should say, it ensures that I'm getting the data that is coming off of my memory cards when I'm filming. And that's huge. And then as always, you want to make sure that your file structures when you are doing data backup are something that you're going to be able to remember and something that just makes sense. And for me, I always start with just a project, the project name, the year, the month, and the day. And then I break that down into further going into like whether it's processed or raw, and then I can even add other subfolders to that too. But you don't have to use this system. But coming up with a really good file structure system will just help organize your files later on, especially if you're using, I think Shade is a new AI program that will basically go in and find all of your media files and then categorize them themselves, and then also allow you to pick and choose, or I guess search using AI technology to see what files you have, what landscapes you have, what people you have, and it's pretty incredible. I don't have a slide for that. I've been tinkering around with it for the last month or so, but it's a pretty interesting thing, and I really enjoy it. And I think that with all of these things together, you guys will be able to create and utilize great data management for yourselves. So if you guys have any questions, let me know, and I appreciate your time. So thank you guys so much. If you guys want to contact me, I'm at Drew Giggity on Instagram. You can check me out on YouTube at Drew Geraci, Twitter, which no longer exists, it's X, or check me out at district7.com. All right.
Wow, dude.
Woo!
That was a ton of information.
Right? Look at that. My hat came off of this so much. I was like, whoo, it's getting hot in here.
No, seriously. I was over here taking notes, writing down questions, but then you got to everything. NVMe is new to me. And I'm guessing there's a lot of people out there who it's like we're still stuck on USB.
Well, I think a lot of people are just stuck on like SSDs because they're like, oh, SSDs are the new thing or hard drives are the new thing. But yeah, NVMe is definitely the way to go just because it's going to offer the fastest transfer rates possible to and from your system. And it's also set up for the future. So if you're using Gen 4 or Gen 5, you're going to just get these incredible transfer rates, and it just makes everybody's life easier, especially if you're taking these large volume files, taking them from A to B, and then you get to go home C. And chill out and enjoy some butter. You know, that's what we're here for.
We're here for the butter.
We're here for the butter.
I'm gonna double down, and if you guys do have questions, now is the time. I mean, this is one of these events where it pays to be there live and be able to ask your questions because that's a lot of information to
It
go
is a lot of
through. You
information.
clearly know your stuff. And I look at it this way. Look, I cried for years because I lost a couple hard drives and it's like, okay, it's
Sure.
just like little pictures. I'm like, man, I can't even imagine the volume of data. Or it's
Mm.
like you're working on a big production, a Hollywood production or something of that magnitude. And it's like, no, my stomach was over here hurting for
Oof.
you with this
It
stuff.
happens all the time though too, which is really funny. I mean, we worked on a project for the X Games a couple of years ago, and we basically came over with Pelican cases full of RAID hard drives. Now, mind you, these are like spinning disk hard drives. This is back in 2015 or so. And we had about 64 terabytes on each one of those drives. And we sent that back to the States, and customs totally destroyed all the drives when they came back. All the spinning drives are just basically toast.
Oh,
They're off their spinners, and thankfully, just as the DP, I have a set or a backup with me at all times as well, just because I want to make sure that the information is saved. But information is important. And when you lose that information and you don't have backups, you're left with nothing. And let's just say you're working on a 50 or $100,000 production. That's time and money you can't ever get back. So it's the data important, or data security and data management, just super important.
definitely. I mean, and I was looking at things on the box of the SSD that I just got that I never even knew to look for. So thank you for that because I thought it was always just about read and write speed and
Yeah.
which is it going to be fastest? That part about the
Yeah.
slowest part of your whole the bottlenecking really is what did it
I
for
think the
me.
bottlenecking is what throws a lot of people off, or they think that the computer that they have is super fast because they bought it, 10 years ago and it was a $10,000 system. And they're like, oh, I can just hook my computer up and transfer this file over quickly. It doesn't work that way. I mean, it really comes down to making sure that you're utilizing the newest protocols and the newest ports to make sure that you're utilizing that bandwidth appropriately. So
Mhm.
it's important.
It definitely is. Andrew, what's the best resource for people for making sure that when you're buying a new setup, you want everything to jive. You don't want to. I think it's one of those things where, especially when you're buying a Mac, a lot
Yeah.
of people don't like now that you can't upgrade the storage. So you kind of got to go all out in the beginning, or
See
do
that's
you?
the downside, and I'm not gonna hate on Mac because I use Macs all the time, but they really limit the user on what they can do for future uses, and
Mhm.
not being able to upgrade the RAM or not being able to upgrade your internal flash drive or SSD, whatever Apple's calling it these days. It's sad because you're not going to be able to benefit from newer technology that's coming out without purchasing an entirely new system. Which is why if you go on the PC side of things, you can obviously upgrade a motherboard, still keep some of the components aligned, so you're saving money there, but then you're gaining speed with the pipelines of the next generation. And I think there needs to be a balance there. And also, if we look at Apple's track record, they aren't so great at putting out new Pro systems every year or every other year, or right now, or like every 5 years. So things to think about because data transfer is super important. And if you don't have those connections or you don't have the bandwidth internally on those chips, you're not going to be able to utilize them.
Yeah, I was ready to ask you like, what's more important, read speed, write speed, and it's like, no, the slowest speed in your entire chain
And yeah,
of.
your entire chain is really what the speed is. So yeah, you could spend thousands of dollars on the fastest hard drive and enclosure and SS or whatever, but if your computer runs at 120 megabytes per second, that's what you're getting,
That was the most interesting, depressing hour.
right?
I'm like, man, I don't know whether to be super excited. It's like I got all this knowledge, but then part of me is just like, oh man, it's a
Well,
it's a crazy
well, we'll
world.
do this talk again in five
Yeah,
years, and we'll be in Gen 8 by then, which will be perfect, and we'll be transferring at, 15 gigabytes per second. It'll be great. It'll be great.
yeah, totally. I mean, especially since now everything is like we're moving everything up to like 50 megapixels is the new 24
Yeah, right.
megapixels and
Oh my
files
gosh.
now.
Well, all these new medium format cameras that are coming out too, where you have gigabyte files, or not gigabyte, like, oh yeah, gigabyte files for
Yeah,
everything. Like it's insane. Easily get it out. Yeah. What was
let's
the
see.
question?
So
With
we have
getting
let's see, with getting
system.
a system into play, what is a good starting point to begin moving forward and building a system on a budget mind? But
Yeah,
would it be
best to
best to
start.
start with what would be the bottleneck first?
Yeah, I mean, the bottleneck first is going to be whatever chipset you're using. So if you are building your own computer, if you're using a new Intel 13,000 series, you'll be able to utilize a very large portion of the bandwidth if you're using Gen 5 PCIe. So what I would look for in a system, if you are on a budget, is making sure that just first off the bat that it's Gen 5. Gen 5 is going to allow you to have those pipelines to be able to move data. But you have to remember too, some systems will only come with a few pipelines, maybe 16, which will only let you have one device being able to utilize that. So while the main hard drive is utilizing it, the external hard drives may not be able to utilize it. And the same goes for your memory and everything else. But if you look at it, just see how many pipelines it has. If it has more than 32 or 64 and in Gen 5, you're probably going to do pretty well, and those will be cheaper. If you go into the higher ranges that are in the hundreds of pipelines, you're going to have a lot more to pay for, I should say, because it's a more server grade things. But definitely, it's hard to say because there's so many different avenues that you can go. But just make sure it's Gen 5 and you won't be disappointed.
Awesome. I'm going to throw in an off topic question here because it did come
Yeah,
in. We'll see if we can get some information out there. One of our YouTube viewers has a Sony A7R5 now. Used to have an A7R4. Notice that the pictures on the A7R5 have more noise. Is this something you experience, number
interesting.
one? And what is your go-to? Just noise reduction in general. Is there anything that you use?
Yeah, I mean, I use a lot of noise reduction. So if you're talking about photos, I mean, Adobe's internal denoise they just added to Lightroom is phenomenal. And if you want to pay for one, you can also use Topaz Labs denoise, and that too is really great. But if you already have the subscription, I'd say stick with Adobe because it's almost on par with that. And can you also do like upscaling and denoising from that upscale as well, utilizing Topaz Labs Gigapixel or AI Gigapixel, which is great. But for me, I've got both the A7R4 and the R5, and I can't say I've noticed a huge difference in the noise. I normally stay at around I would say I don't go over 32,000 or 3200 ISO, and it is kind of noisy. But you also have to realize that these are 60 megapixel cameras, so they're going to have very noticeable noise just because the photons on the sensor are so small. Not like if you're using like an FX3 or an A7S3 because they have larger pixel points on the area, or I'm using the incorrect terminology, but basically the photo sensors are much larger on those sensors, which is why you have a lower megapixel rate. So I would say just try to utilize different software to eliminate that, the noise, and then you'll be able to kind of go from there. But I absolutely love my A7R4 and my R5. And my R5 is actually one of my favorite cameras just because the color quality and the dynamic range are just so great. And yeah, can't complain.
Awesome. Well, Andrew, I want to thank you. Like you said, we're probably going to have you back in not even 5 years, man. I feel like the way everything's going, AI's here now.
Right?
So who knows what's going to happen? AI might change the way we store things, and who
Yeah,
knows? Uh, I see we got a
perfect.
question slipped in.
We do
Cecil,
have a question from Cecil.
let's see. I
You
also
have the
have the
Dell
Dell.
770.
Go
I'm
for it.
literally on my Dell 7770 right now as well. Transfer line, and it's horrible. Okay. Sure. What I don't know, Cecil, if you're here, the question would be is what kind of hard drive are you using and what port are you using on the unit? Because I'm also using the Dell Precision 7770 and I usually a sustained rate of anywhere between 1250 and 2000 megabytes per second if I'm utilizing my Thunderbolt OWC NVMe right here. And I really like that. But what could be a problem is the actual cable that you're using. And a lot of people don't realize that not all cables are created equal. And a $5 cable versus a $100 cable can really be the difference between transferring at 1,000 megabytes per second or 100 megabytes per second. And you also want to make sure the distance of that cable is less than 2 meters or 6 feet. You really want to be utilizing cables that are probably more like 2 to 3 feet max because that's going to give you the best bandwidth. But the longer the cable goes, the less bandwidth you're going to have, especially in a 40 gigabit connection. So keep that in mind. Shorter, always better. And use certified Thunderbolt cables if you can, because that at least know you're going to get the fastest transfer rates.
Awesome. Yeah, that was another thing that I didn't even think about. I mean, most of us run into it when we realize it. You use the cable
Oh
that comes
yeah.
with the hard drive, and then you swap out that random USB-C cable that you just
Right.
happen to have in your drawer next to you, and it's like, wait, why does it not work, or why does it not
Why does
read,
it
or
not work? Here's a fun story too, and it's one of the reasons why I get aggravated with Apple is because they don't tell you how fast the transfer rates are going. And I was doing a side by side with a friend of mine, and he's like, "Why is your data transferring so much faster than mine? We're using the same drive and everything." But he was using a different cable, and that cable basically downgraded his speed, and he didn't know about it because Apple doesn't allow you to see what the transfer rate is. So it's just like it took twice the amount of time, but it was all because of the cable he was using. So being able to see those actual numbers with transfer speeds is, I think, super important too, which is why I do enjoy looking at Windows in that regard, just because it allows you to see all that data as it's coming through in real time.
awesome. Well, Andrew, thank you, if for nothing else, for making us aware of all the things
There we
we
go.
have to. It's a checklist of things. It's no longer just looking at everyone else is like, okay, 2 TB, 4 TB, that's all I need. No, there's so
Right.
many other
Yeah.
things that are so much more important to your experience. I mean, you know when you buy one of those slow hard drives and you kick yourself in the butt afterwards, and you're like, wish I would have looked at all this.
Yeah.
There we go, Cecil.
Ah,
Cheapest
see,
hard
so
drive, cheap
yeah,
Thunderbolt cable.
what I would suggest doing is seeing if you can use a different Thunderbolt cable and just see if that remedies the situation. But I'd also have to see if it's a G-Tech drive. G-Tech doesn't necessarily use the best internals when it comes to the hard drives, so you could be utilizing slower drives there as well. So you could just get slower. Is it a standard? Is it an NVMe drive, Cecil, or is it a standard hard drive, or is it just a regular SSD? And maybe that's something for another time. But if you want, Cecil, hit me up after this, and I'll see if I can help troubleshoot some of this stuff for you. But I just want to say thank you very much to Sony. Thank you very much to B&H for having me. Always a pleasure, and it's always a fun time talking with you, Derek. And hopefully we can talk more butter next time. All right.
Likewise, Andrew, you took us out perfectly. Huge thank you to Andrew,
Boom.
Sony, to all of our viewers out there. Another edition of the B&H Event Space now in the books. We'll catch y'all next time.